Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation on building the International Panel for Climate Change Data Distribution Centre Data Catalogue. It's a bit of a mouthful. I'll refer to the IPCC Data Distribution Centre as the DDC going forward. But this is all about our vision to make climate data more fair. So that means more findable, more accessible, more interoperable and more reusable. Before I go on, a little bit more about me. My name's Adam Millward and I'm CEO and co-founder of METADATAWORKS. We're a UK-based SME on a mission to make public data fairer by delivering novel and user-friendly metadata management solutions. We've been working with the DDC since May 2021. And today I'm going to take you through our 6-month journey with the DDC and our plans for the future. In particular, the work we've done to establish a web-based data catalogue and a descriptive metadata schema for the organisation. I'll start with the context of the organisation and some of their requirements. I'll also introduce some of the key principles we established for schema design and talk about the process we follow to coalesce around a quality output. And finally, I wanted to share some learnings from the process and the wider implications for some of the other areas of science. A little bit more about the context of the DDC. So the DDC was formed in 1997 to disseminate the data underlying the IPCC reports and to make data transparent and build trust. And currently there are 4 partners. There's the German Climate Computing Centre, DKRZ. There's the Centre for International Earth Science Information Network, CESIN, who receives funding from NASA. There's the Spanish Research Council, CSIC, and there's also METADATAWORKS, who are working on behalf of the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So climate change is happening and we know it's going to worsen in the decades to come. Government, corporations, educators, journalists and systems group all need access to credible, relevant data on the causes, impacts and effective mitigation strategies for climate change to support the most important decisions of our generation. And we also know that enormous effort goes into climate change research, particularly around producing this valuable and really clean data. And this data has a myriad of potential users across different scientific domains and communities. So disseminating the data for reuse is extremely important as it ensures the value of the data is always maximised. So we know the data is incredibly important, but there are some challenges. Given the interdisciplinary nature of climate science, the DDC must deal with a wide variety of data. For example, data can take the form of weather data, social impact surveys, visual and geographical data, and all of this data has variations in format, variation in attributes, in scale, in breadth. Another challenge is there's no centralised data store for the DDC, so each DDC partner shares collective responsibility for archival, and storing the data sets separately across the various sites can be a challenge when you're trying to bring all the information together. There's high demand for the data, so between 2019 and 2020, the website was averaging around 2,000 visitors a month, but we saw that there was a really high bounce rate. And by bounce rate, I mean the number of visitors who left the site, came to the site and left very, very quickly without exploring and accessing the data beyond the first page. The other challenge that we noticed was the organisation definitely has limited resources. The DDC doesn't have full-time staff and all of the DDC members undertake their responsibilities alongside their institutional and organisational roles. So within this context and given these challenges, we tried to propose a solution that included improved landing pages that would be simple to understand and use for new users to the site. We worked with the community to agree a metadata schema that would make the data more findable through a central data catalogue instance that would federate across the different catalogues. And we also knew that we'd need an easy-to-use data onboarding process for the data from the new assessment reports, because we could have the best data catalogue in the world, but if it didn't have the data, it wouldn't be really useful for the users. So we tried to minimise the burden of onboarding data as much as possible. But before we could launch this solution, the key thing that we needed to do was agree a standard way of describing the data, a metadata schema. So we brought together a range of IPCC stakeholders, including members of the DDC and representatives from the working groups who were producing the reports. And the first thing to do was agree a set of rules that would determine the design process for the catalogue and the schema. So these were some of the rules that we set out, and they allowed us to successfully deliver that very, very quickly. Those rules were, firstly, that we were aiming for good enough, not perfect. We could be here for years if we wanted perfect. But the main thing was to get something out there that was good, that was reviewed, collect data and then iterate quickly. So the first version was all about being good enough. We wanted to base that schema on user needs. So we know that collecting this data is a burden on the system. So every single attribute that we wanted to collect needed a really, really good reason to collect it. And then when we decided whether it was included in the schema, we assessed it on impact versus effort. So how much time it took to collect that data versus how much value it was to the system. We also tried as much as possible to use a standard. We decided we used the WC3 DCAT standard wherever possible. And if we couldn't find an attribute from that standard to describe the data, then we might use another standard such as Dublin Core or DDI or one of the other standards that are out there. We also made sure that we engaged all of the stakeholders involved across the community to ensure adoption and support for the standard when we brought it forward. And we tried to version control everything we did so that process was really, really clear. So what was our design approach? Well, in order to develop the schema, we took a number of steps. Firstly, we undertook some research on the existing descriptive metadata schemas that were being used across the different stakeholders. We looked at their similarities and we looked at their differences and we compared them against the standard. The second area is that we engaged a metadata focus group with representatives from all the stakeholder groups to determine what that schema would look like. And this focus group held 4 meetings over a month to review the proposed draft schema, to debate inclusions and exclusions and measure each proposed attribute against the rules that we've just discussed. They could then debate and feedback, and the schema was iterated over time. And finally, we published that schema, making it available to the public on our GitHub, and you can find a PDF human-readable version that explains all the attributes, as well as a machine-readable JSON online. I'll share those resources later in the presentation. So over the next few slides, I'd like to take you through some of the highlights of the schema. There are around 40 attributes under 6 subheadings, covering summary details, data documentation, provenance, data access, and the use of the data, as well as geographical and temporal coverage and links and tools that could potentially add value and enrich the data sets that are already there. So the first section I'd like to take a look at is the summary section, and this essentially allowed us to support the key features of the data catalogue and the ability to mint digital object identifiers through DataCite. DOIs have been commonly associated with journal articles, but there's been growing movement to generate DOIs for datasets to acknowledge the importance of data as a citable product for research, and we were really keen to do that, and all of the attributes we need for that are contained within the summary section. The second area I think it's worth looking at is the resource creator section, where we can credit the authors of the datasets. IPCC reports are authored by teams of international experts who often volunteer their time to prepare these reports. So it's really important their names is listed of authors of both the reports but also the data, so the full contribution is acknowledged. So we're very keen to include this across the schema. Another area where the focus group held significant discussions was around coverage. The aim of these fields is enabling users in the future to really search and filter on geographical and temporal coverage so that users can hone in on the data they need as quickly as possible. Under the enrichment and linkage section, we've included a field to capture URLs for tools or any code or any models that you've generated around the data. And we anticipate using this field to link to code repositories in the future, as well as kind of tools that would allow you to reproduce those figures and findings. And the last area, we include the ability to link datasets as part of a collection, so data groupings can be used to group that data together. So ultimately, the agreement on that schema and that standard way of describing data enabled us to start building the IPCC data catalogue, and we'll share a link to that later so you can go and explore that. Essentially, the data catalogue is an application which now forms part of the DDC website. It only contains a small number of records for now, but the plans are to increase over time. We should have over 1,000 entries in the new year. And essentially, it's a secure cloud-based web application where you can go to search and understand the data that's there, and it promotes data discovery and it promotes data reuse. So what were the learnings from this project? Well, development is ongoing, so these are definitely initial and we'll continue to iterate and improve both the schema and the technology. But in terms of learnings we've found so far. I think there was a high level of common ground between the metadata schemas and the stakeholders. Initially, it felt like too broad an area to define a single schema across the different domains, given the formats and data types. But I think we quickly realised there was enough similarity, especially in the user search experience, to justify a single schema across all of those different data sets. Second area that it's worth sharing some learnings is some of the stakeholders were concerned about the time and effort it would take to transition to a new schema and a new data archival process. I think to mitigate these concerns, we created mappings between existing schemas and the new proposed schemas, and this enabled historical data to be loaded fairly quickly. So I think that was really successful. It's worth noting that in some cases we had to relax constraints and create a few more optional fields, and that's something you always have to do when you're doing these kind of historical data migrations, because some of that data has been collected years ago and we just weren't going to be able to pull in the extra information that we needed. And finally, in terms of a key learning, was that you really need to plan the time and effort it takes to involve all those stakeholders so that you can gather those meaningful contributions when you're creating an interdisciplinary schema. It's a critical path activity when you're creating a data catalogue. You need a shared understanding of what you're going to use within the catalogue, so it's important to really make time to schedule in this activity and get the stakeholder buy-in. So we launched the service in November 2022 with a small number of data sets. Our plans are from here to firstly increase the amount of data by importing existing record from partners, and also for bringing in the new data for the IPCC Assessment Report 6. We expect to have over 1,000 entries in the new year, and that should grow every month. We're also looking to collect feedback from both data producers who are onboarding data that according to the schema, as well as the data users who are using the schema to discover data. And this feedback will refine the process and refine the schema in the new year. And we're going to look to bring the focus group together in the new year to develop a new iteration, a new version of that schema based on the feedback. Once the schema has been tested and refined, we're actually going to try and look to getting it recognised and endorsed as a standard for climate science. My co-founder sits on a number of metadata boards, the ISO 11179 board, and a number of British Standards Institute committees, and I think we're looking to see whether there's a potential avenue to get that recognised and endorsed as a climate change metadata schema or profile. And finally, really, we're looking to improve the process and the tool. So it's really about iterating as we go, and we work with the various users over the next few years. In terms of wider implications of the project, I think the first to note is that we've improved the data documentation for climate data. Now it's consistent and comprehensive. And this means that the data is more reusable for DDC members and the general public in the future. The second really is all about improved data findability. Climate data isn't easy to find, and we're really trying to change that. The third area is around standardization. So we're creating the opportunity to bring together data from lots of different catalogues and actually federate that information to present a kind of consolidated view and search experience that improves metadata sharing and data discovery in the future. And finally, we believe this process and the learnings from it are transferable and relevant to many different interdisciplinaries area of science. So in conclusion, we've developed the new improved IPCC DDC data catalogue, and it provides a centralised repository that's making climate change data more findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable for stakeholders worldwide. I think it's an example of a successful interdisciplinary collaboration. We've optimised it for data discovery in the future, and ultimately I think it's encouraged standardisation and interoperability in the future, which is really great. It's something we're very proud of. If you want to find out more, there are a number of different resources you can go and explore. So there's the IPCC DDC website, so please go and have a play with the catalogue, give us some feedback through the service desk and through the forms. We've also got a GitHub where we're publishing the schema, so please feel free again to go there and explore. And if you want to learn a little bit more about some of the work that we do, please come to our website or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. And lastly, thanks for listening.